First, she was the subject of a statewide Amber Alert, and now she's a convicted killer whose alleged co-conspirator is still on the run a year and a half later. There are a lot of details in this case, a lot of moving parts, so let's start with the basics where this happened. That's in Garland, Texas, which is a suburb of Dallas. And on August 29, 2023, Garland emergency responders got a 911 call reporting a man in a vehicle had slumped over. The caller said this happened in Audubon Park, and they were worried that this person could be unconscious. So when first responders arrived to the scene, they find 21-year-old Arturo Pena, who had actually been reported missing 2 days prior to all this. But Pena wasn't unconscious. In fact, he'd been shot, and very quickly, a murder investigation ensued. At the same time that all of this is happening, 17-year-old Natalie Navarro's parents are getting super worried. She hasn't come home, they haven't heard from her in a while, so like any concerned parents, they call emergency responders and an Amber Alert is put out for Natalie. She's found a couple days later on September 1st in Webb County, Texas. And just to map this out for you, she was last seen in Garland, Texas, that's right by Dallas. And Webb County is about 500 miles south, right on the border of Mexico. Pretty quickly, investigators realized this wasn't an Amber Alert situation. In fact, Natalie was willingly on the run, trying to flee to Mexico because of her involvement in Arturo Pena's murder. So investigators quickly connect the dots that Natalie had met Arturo Pena online and had asked him to come to Audubon Park under the guise of a date. But when he arrives there, Natalie isn't alone. In fact, she's got her boyfriend there, 21-year-old Yordi Martinez. He also goes by the name Jordy. Natalie says this was supposed to be a robbery. That's why they lured Pena to the park in the first place. But something went wrong, and she says Martinez pulled the trigger, shot and killed Arturo Pena. After that, they both go on the run. And we know what happens with Natalie. She's taken into custody. But Martinez is still on the run. I want to remind you, this murder happened in August of 2023. That means he's been on the run for 17 months at this point. There have been a couple reported sightings of him though, specifically in Laredo, Texas. That's right on the border of Texas and Mexico. But unfortunately, investigators weren't able to track him down, and Martinez is still on the lam. We can count on where Natalie Navarro is though. She's been in jail ever since she was arrested down in Webb County. Her bond was set at $1 million, but she never posted it, so she's been in jail ever since. In November of 2023, Natalie Navarro was indicted by a grand jury on charges of capital murder and robbery. Now, the robbery she admits to and says, yes, I was part of that. But she says she had nothing to do with the murder. She says that it actually was Yordi Martinez, her ex-boyfriend. But all that didn't really help Natalie. She was convicted on the murder charge and recently sentenced. The judge did give her credit for 425 days served, but he still slapped her with a 40-year sentence. So let's take a closer look at this story. And for that, I'm going to bring in former CIA officer and FBI agent Tracy Walder. And Tracy, the reason I wanted to talk to you today was because you and I have actually talked about this story in the past, back in 2023 when it first happened. And the reason we covered it is because it was an Amber Alert situation that then turned into a murder suspect. I mean, right from the jump, does that happen often?
Well, thank you for having me again, Sierra. Obviously, the short answer to that is no. That is not something that happens often, clearly, in a situation like this. But I will say that law enforcement very quickly cleared that Amber Alert. So they were able to make a determination very quickly that this was not a child that had gone missing or that had been kidnapped.
Hey guys, I have to pause for just a second to tell you about this free app called Upside that gets you cash back on daily essentials like gas and groceries. I'm so into Upside. I now use it every single time I pump my gas because it's so easy, it's free, and of course that cash back. So here's what you do. Download the Upside app for free and buy whatever you plan to purchase. File that claim in the app and that's it. Then you get paid. To find out how much you could save with Upside, click the link in the description or scan the QR code on your screen and use our promo code LCNews to get an extra 25 cents back on every gallon on your first tank of gas. Yeah, it turned out she wasn't missing. She actually was on the run from this murder slash robbery situation. And I wanted to talk about that too, going back to 2023 when all of this first happened. The victim is found and investigators are on the scene. How do they so quickly make up their minds, or not make up their minds, rather zero in on a suspect? They have her and her boyfriend at the time that they figure out really quickly were involved. How is that?
Yeah, you're right, because really a lot of this case involved social media, at least it seems like to me. She lured him in, right? Using dating apps, social media, those kinds of things, lured him to that location. And so processing a phone, right, and digital evidence takes time. Even in an emergent situation, it can take a day or so. And so in this case, I would have expected it to take some time. So I don't believe that that is how they identified her through, forensic digital evidence. I think either identifying information was left at the scene, maybe her identification, maybe something with her name on it, that drew them to her so quickly, because this was very, very rapid that that Amber Alert was withdrawn.
And one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you today, too, not just your wild experience that always lends itself for these stories, but the fact that you are in Texas and this happened in Garland, not too far from Dallas. And I know oftentimes when we talk about Texas, we talk about the Mexican border right there. I mean, it is a ways away from Garland, about 7 hours, but still people have been known to run. And when our suspect here, Natalie Navarro, is found, she's found pretty close to the border. That kind of gets me thinking she was probably trying to run, but she was only 17 at the time. Is that maybe why she wasn't able to cross the border?
In my opinion, no. Laredo is obviously that's where she was apprehended, is obviously very close. It's a border town. It's about 7 or 8 hours away. There's no question that she was trying to cross the border. I don't believe her age would have been a factor. I think she would have crossed, most likely illegally, into Mexico, and people would not have necessarily known that she was crossing there. So I'm not certain that her age would have precluded her from being able to get across. But yes, she was dangerously close to the border. And I'm obviously very glad that they apprehended her when they did, because once people cross the border, it can take years, if at all, for them to be captured and then extradited back to the United States.
Yeah, that's another road I want to go down on too, because she obviously was taken into custody, and we can talk about that in a minute. But her co conspirator, her boyfriend at the time, was on the run, and still to this day, a year and a half later, is still on the run. There were reports that he was seen in March around a different border town, so nearby in Mexico. Some people are thinking he may have crossed the border. And if that is the case, if he really crossed the border and is in Mexico, how do we go about finding him?
My gut tells me he's probably crossed into Mexico. Obviously, I don't know for certain, but it just makes the most sense given the situation. And as you mentioned before, the fact that the state I live in is a border state. We have an extradition treaty with Mexico. We have had that since the 70s. And so we work with them a lot to bring individuals back. What they are probably doing is working with the FBI's legal attache office in Mexico City. They're working with representatives there as well as with the US Marshals. Clearly, Mexican authorities and Mexican law enforcement do know that this individual may be there. They probably issued bolos or be on the lookout for them, for him as well. Also, if he does come into contact with law enforcement, maybe he's taken in for another crime within Mexico, Mexico would then know to alert our legal attache there. Then they would work through that extradition process, which can take months.
My next question, as far as the extradition, let's say that he actually is in custody, they capture him down in Mexico, we've got him all as well. The next question is he would be facing a capital murder charge, and that could be a death penalty case in Texas. And I wonder if that affects things at all.
Yes, it does. So the death penalty would have to be taken off the table for extradition, because Mexico does not have the death penalty and they will not extradite if that is on the table. We saw this actually with El Chapo as well. The death penalty was taken off the table in terms of the federal charges that he faced. So yes, he would be looking at life in prison, obviously, if convicted of capital murder. And yes, Texas does have the death penalty. But in order to get him back, which is, I think, ultimately what everyone wants, they would have to take the death penalty off the table, or else Mexico will not extradite him.
It does seem like he probably crossed the border and is in Mexico. Still just a guess, though, because we don't know where he is. So let's just speculate for 1 second and say he actually didn't go across the border and he's still in the United States, Texas, somewhere nearby. How is it that this guy has stayed off the radar for a year and a half? No one has really seen him. We haven't gotten texts from him, things like that.
That's why my gut tells me he's not in Texas, though he may have family in Texas and also in Mexico, who is helping him, keep himself out of the bullseye of law enforcement, with, if you will. So I believe that that is something that he could be doing. Also, we haven't seen any electronic activity. Well, at least police most likely have not seen electronic banking activity and those kinds of things. Clearly, he's ditched his cell phone because they would be geolocating that data as well. And so, what that tells me is that he may actually have people helping him or may have a large amount of cash that he was using if he is here in the United States. But again, I don't think that he is.
A large amount of cash, that kind of gets me thinking about the robbery situation, which we talked about a bit at the beginning, and I want to go back to. So, the way that the victim was found in this case was online apps, social media, met up with the girl, Natalie Navarro, and then the other suspect is there, allegedly kills him. That to me just is very frightening because so many people meet their significant others and they're awesome and it's great on social media. It's a really great way to connect with people. But then there are the horror stories like this one. And I wonder if there could have been any signs that something was off.
That's a good question. I don't know necessarily. People who are doing this are preying, right, on people's insecurities and desire, right, for love and affection and those kinds of things. I have nothing against dating apps. Heck, I met my own husband on one almost 20 years ago now. But I do think that one of the things that we should do, and individuals that are using dating apps should always do, is always let someone know your location, share your location on your phone, on whatever device you are using. Share that with someone else. Also, if you can, bring someone with you. If you feel uncomfortable, I don't think there is anything wrong with just kind of going on a meet and greet sort of date with an individual for the first time. And also, going with them to very populated locations like coffee shops, restaurants, those kinds of things. This had taken place in a park. So he was lured to, I've actually been to this park before. It is not a heavily traveled park, to be honest. And the location he was at is very densely covered with brush. And so I think remembering those things when going on, first dates with someone is always something, to think about. But I'm not sure that there would have been warning signs other than the fact that they were meeting up at this park.
You really can never be too careful in these situations, not to victim blame at all. This person was doing what they were free to do and they should not be blamed at all. They did not deserve murder, just to specify. But we should all be keeping track of things and sharing our locations. I totally agree. And I do that with my friends and family. So I think that's a good lesson for everyone. Moving on, though, talking about Natalie Navarro. She has confessed, apparently, talking about this robbery. She says, yes, hand up, I was part of it. But she says she didn't pull the trigger and she should not be responsible for murder. That was all her boyfriend, Martinez. How do we decide, or figure out rather, who is the one who really pulled the trigger?
With Mr. Pena, I think we always think about women being susceptible to violence, right, on dates and those kinds of things. And we have to remember that men are just as much, as vulnerable. And he didn't do anything wrong. No one deserves any of this. But I do think with Miss Navarro, she is just as culpable, whether she pulled the trigger or not. Now, they may have found the gun at the scene. I don't know exactly what the catalog of evidence was. And if that's the case, then they probably tested her hands for gunpowder, as well as, the gun for fingerprints and those kinds of things that were left there. And if that's the case, then they would be able to easily tell who most likely had the gun in her hands. Obviously, with her boyfriend, they would not have the luxury of testing him for gunpowder, as it's been far too long to have that residue, but they may have been able to obtain fingerprints on the scene to show exactly who had it. But the reality is she led him there and most likely knew what the outcome was going to be of that situation. And so those are going to be very difficult charges for her to escape. She may not have actively pulled the trigger. I don't know what evidence police have, but the reality is she was just as complicit in Mr. Pena's death as her boyfriend.
So even though she says she didn't do it, it's pretty much determined that she has because she was charged with capital murder. Then she is now guilty and sentenced to 40 years behind bars. So she's been in jail ever since she was captured, rescued, whatever you want to call it. She was 17 at the time, and now she has the next 2 decades to be behind bars. Just an opinion question. Do you agree with that? Do you think that's a good sentence?
It's a typical sentence in a situation like this where you have someone who is underage at the time the crime was committed. I understand she wasn't obviously underage at the time of her conviction. She was 19. Typically, in a situation where you have a 17-year-old, they could get as much as life. They are typically not sentenced to the death penalty simply because of the age. It tends to be frowned upon. Whether we agree or disagree on that is obviously up for discussion, but that's very typical in a situation like this. Now, we can argue that 40 years may not be enough. She should be facing life because she took a life, right? But the jury or the judge in this case felt that 40 years was enough, and the reality is she will be 59, 60, right at the time of her release. So that is the majority of her life that she will be spending in prison. It will preclude her right from marriage, children, any kind of family that she was thinking of. And so I think that this is a normal sentence that they would give someone of her age.
Yeah, based on what you're saying, it makes sense and it adds up. That's most of her life behind bars. So we know where Navarro is. We can count on that for at least the next 2 decades. But as far as her boyfriend Martinez, we still don't know, something we talked about a lot throughout this interview. And there isn't much details. Again, he may have been seen near a border town in March, but we can't confirm it. Is it possible that investigators are closer to finding him than they're letting on or making public?
That's a great question. In my opinion, not necessarily. The more time, right, that he has potentially across the border, which is what I personally believe has happened, the more time he has to kind of sink into oblivion, if you will. However, what I will say is I believe it was a case 7 or 8 years ago here in Dallas of Kendra Hatcher, who was a dentist, who was shot in the head in her apartment complex by a woman who did flee to Mexico. They had a hard time finding her, but did eventually find her after more than a year in Mexico. She was turned in. And so she was extradited back to the United States. So it has happened before, but as more time passes, it does obviously become more and more difficult.
I guess we're going to have to keep following the case and see what does happen. As you said, it's more difficult, but hopefully some sort of resolution for the family. Tracy Walter, thank you for coming on and giving us some insight into this case.
Thank you for having me, Sierra.
I wanted to give you one last look at our suspect, Yordi or Jordi Martinez. He's described as having black hair, brown eyes. He weighs about 120 pounds. He's 5'7", and this specific part you want to pay attention to, he's missing one of his front teeth. Anyone with more information about where Martinez could be is asked to contact the Garland Police Department. And if you want to remain anonymous, you can. Just submit a tip to their Crime Stoppers. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Sierra Gillespie.